Welcome to Larry King Now. My special guest is Dr. Anders Ericsson, professor of psychology at Florida State University and an expert on experts. Dr. Ericsson studies how expertise is acquired and maintained through extended deliberate practice. His new book is Peak: Secrets from the New Science of Expertise. Robert Poole is its co-author. Doctor, what's the definition of an expert?
Well, we're really looking for people who consistently can perform at a very high level in whatever domain that they want to be experts at. So for example, a doctor, a surgeon who can actually perform a surgery with better outcomes than their colleagues, that we would refer to as an expert performer.
And what got you interested in the subject?
Well, I think like most people, I kind of was interested in trying to be my best. And I think looking at people that I consider to really demonstrate that superiority and then hopefully understand what they're thinking and then trying to figure out ways that I would be able to kind of learn how to think like they are thinking. That was kind of my original motivation of really trying to understand how I and all sorts of other people would be able to improve their performance in virtually any domain.
But you talk about things like deliberate practice. Does an expert know that they're doing this, or do they do it kind of automatically?
Well, if you select people who really are outstanding and performing at a much higher level, I've found consistently that they have a history of training. Often they've been working with a coach or a teacher for a long period of time. So they basically, together with their teacher, have been working on improving aspects gradually during their development. And that's essentially how they were able to get to the point where they're at.
How much of it is natural talent, though?
Well, that I think is a very interesting question. And once we start looking at people and analyzing exactly what it is that they're really good at, we find that we can find this history of practice and training that seems to explain, at least it seems to be necessary for them to have done that to reach this high level. So this idea that somebody more or less discovers suddenly that they're extremely good at something, I've yet to find even a single example of that type of phenomenon.
So a lot of people think they're experts and they're not, right? We see it on television every day.
Well, I think there are two different ways of thinking about experts. You can either be an expert because other people, including yourself, claim that you're an expert. I guess what we're interested in are people who really can objectively demonstrate their superior performance, like an athlete who is able to perform an event much better than anyone else, or a chess master that anybody can challenge and not be able to beat.
You know, I've never heard the term expert applied to athletes. I have a great admiration for athletes. I have two young sons. They're both baseball players. They work at it every day. They play every day. They practice every day. But I've never heard the term used expert with regard to athletes.
Well, it's consistent with this idea that we're looking for anybody who can perform at a higher level. And I think athletes is one of the best examples of individuals who are able to kind of demonstrate objectively that their performance is higher than other individuals. And especially if you think about track athletes who are, running 100 meters or basically throwing the javelin or something, there's no question who is exceptional in their performance. And I guess the exciting idea is that there seem to be some general principles that explain superior performance, whether it's in sports, in music, in ballet, in basically being a professional writer or being a surgeon. So the idea here is that there's similar kinds of principles that can explain and that are necessary for somebody to reach a very high level of performance in any field.
What is deliberate practice?
Well, a lot of people, recreational golfers might go out on the golf course and say that they're kind of practicing. Now, what we're arguing is that when we look at people who are really reaching a very high level, they're working with their teachers who identify something that they specifically would want to improve with respect to their performance. And then they engage in some kind of training activity that basically now tries to hone that particular aspect. So for us, deliberate practice, it requires that the teacher would be able to look at your performance and then say, at your current level of performance, here's an aspect that you can improve in the next couple of weeks. And then also tell you about what kind of training activity should you engage in order to, reach that new level of performance with respect to the selected goal.
And then it becomes what drives you, right?
I think that is exactly the question here, because what we find is that when you're actually trying to do something that you can't do, which is essentially deliberate practice, because you're trying to improve your performance to a level that you haven't yet reached, that requires a lot of concentration and focus and effort. So that in itself is not very enjoyable. So what we find is that expert performers, they're really looking at the goal, or basically the result. So if you're during a training session, feel that you've improved your performance, that's when you really get that feeling of satisfaction and enjoyment. So for example, a musician may find it particularly enjoyable to play in front of an audience and now see how the audience get emotionally moved by the music that they're producing. So that now provides kind of a motivation for them then to go back after the public performance and work and try to do an even better job the next time they perform.
Our guest is the psychologist Anders Ericsson. Coming up, we'll discuss the potential downside to expertise and whether Anders considers people like Leonardo DiCaprio or Serena Williams experts. Stay with us. We're back with Dr. Anders Ericsson, the author of Peak, Secrets from the New Science of Expertise. I've been interviewing people for 59 years. I never call myself an expert. Am I an expert?
Well, in my mind, and I think it's always a question what you're an expert at. And I have to say that the way you're interviewing people strikes me to really exemplify, the very highest level of performance. And being able to do like you did, do it on a daily basis, that kind of reproducible superior performance, that is kind of what we define as expert performance.
But I loved it, and I just kept doing it every day. I guess I was following something. It's a practice I didn't know I was doing. I just liked it.
I guess it would be interesting for me especially when you started doing interviews, whether you reflected on how you were doing and whether you were thinking about ways that you might be able to do it better when you're interviewing somebody else. And if I recall, one thing that really amazed me when I read a story about you was the fact that you were very concerned here about getting enough sleep so you would be able to be completely focused during the interviews.
Correct.
Am I remembering that correctly?
You are correct, yes. It was important to be clear-headed and also to be in the moment. But I didn't have a teacher. I didn't have a coach. But a lot of what you're discussing here, you need, the athlete especially and others, need teachers, coaches, mentors, right?
Right. I think that makes the process much easier. But, in any domain, there's going to be pioneers, people who are actually reaching a very, very high level performance without having a teacher. So there are going to be individuals who are actually by maybe more trial and error than would be necessary if you had a teacher that would actually be able to guide your training. But I think we always see in all sorts of domains that the first people who really almost started defining the domain, they were forced to basically develop their skill by themselves.
Would you call yourself an expert on experts?
I think I would.
I would.
I think if I'm an expert at something, it's probably studying other people's expert performance. Being able to develop methods like, for example, having them think out loud when they're performing or preparing to perform, that is a method that I've been working with now for several decades.
Any downside to expertise?
I think if you really define now the superior performance as a criterion for somebody being an expert performer, I'm not sure that there are. However, I would say that there's a lot of downsides with people who just call themselves experts without now having the performance to back it up. And I know, for example, that with more experience, people don't, like in the health professions, they don't actually have better patient outcomes. But one thing that happens is that they think of themselves as being experts once they have more experience. And they also are more confident in that they're doing the right thing, when in fact, they're no more accurate than some of the less experienced individuals.
One of my favorite columnists, New York Times columnist, Nicholas Kristof, he wrote in 2009 that so-called experts turned out to be, in many situations, a stunningly poor source of expertise.
I think that's a perfect quote. And I've heard people say that experts or so-called experts, they are basically experts at explaining why their predictions failed. Because now there's actually research showing that professional forecasters are no better than college students in actually being accurate in their long-term forecasts.
Is there a link between expertise and memory?
We find that the expert develops kind of a way of seeing in the current situation all the relevant factors. And people have found that if you suddenly remove the vision, the expert actually can reproduce pretty much the important elements of the situation. I guess a particularly famous line of research have shown chess positions. And there, if you present them for a couple of seconds, then the expert can pretty much reproduce, especially if they're world class, the entire location of all the pieces, whereas an amateur is only able to reproduce 4 or 5 pieces. So across the board, we see that the expert has a much more refined representation of the situation that they're currently working in.
Can nationality affect it? You're Swedish. Do people in Scandinavia have a different perspective on expertise, say, than people in the United States?
Well, I think there are big individual differences in Sweden and here. My feeling is that, at least I grew up in a family where the claim was that you could achieve anything if you were just willing and motivated to do whatever it took in terms of finding teachers and training, that you could actually reach that level by your own efforts. And I think, I found a lot of Swedes where this is true, and I also found a lot of Americans that hold that view. And I find that it's a much more positive view than a view that some other people who kind of argue that there are these invisible limits that makes it impossible for some people to achieve certain levels. And when you really look at the scientific evidence for these limits, I just don't find that evidence.
All right, I'll discuss some people. An actor like Leonardo DiCaprio, is he an expert in acting?
I certainly would argue that he demonstrates, the actor's performance of actually being able to do something where I think very few actors would even come close at actually giving an equally good rendition. And he meets that criterion of having done it several times. So I would certainly argue that as an actor, he really is an expert actor.
Is Serena Williams, the tennis player, an expert?
I think she would be one of the best examples for somebody who is an expert performer in tennis. And she's shown, by winning all these tournaments that she's better than all her competitors.
Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs, I think, is, if I were to kind of hone in on what I think was so amazing about him, was his ability here of producing computers that really sort of made individuals form kind of an attraction to these and really make them sort of into personalized parts of their lives. So the design that he was able to produce and what he was able to motivate his coworkers to generate, I think that was really unique. And I would argue he did that several times, so he would meet the criterion for being an expert performer in that particular domain.
I interviewed him when he started Apple. Do you think he knew he was changing the world?
I think most people, and I think probably him, are motivated of trying to do their best and maybe not too worrying about, exactly what's going to happen in the future. But if you're looking at what it is that you can control and try to do the best that is possible for you, I think that would be kind of the hallmark of somebody who is likely to succeed.
Thank you so much, Professor Anders Ericsson, a great guest.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much, Larry.
The book is Peak, Secrets from the New Science of Expertise, available on Amazon. As always, you can find me on Twitter at King's Things. We'll see you next time.